Today, I'm very happy to welcome two experts, I would say, in the Philadelphia community in the startup space, and two very close partners to Penn and PCI in all of our activities. We have Brett Topche, the co-founder and managing director from Red and Blue Ventures. Um, Red and Blue Ventures is a venture firm that invests only in Penn affiliated startups and founders and is based at the Pennovation Center. And joined with, in addition to Brett, we have Andy Hamilton, a partner at Morgan Lewis and Bockius, and a longtime operator, supporter, and partner for the startup community and many specific startups. So with that, Andy, why don't you start with your introduction? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Laurie. My name's Andy Hamilton. I'm a partner at Morgan Lewis, and I specialize in representing startup companies. Our firm is a national and global law firm, and attorneys across the firm in lots of different disciplines, work with me and the startups that we represent to make sure that all the different topics, that come up are covered. So really almost any type of issue that, an early stage company would need help on, from intellectual property to equity compensation to labor and employment, all of those kinds of things are covered by the firm. We work with very early stage companies, sometimes on a informal basis, to make sure that on a cost effective basis, we're providing support to them so that they grow and don't make mistakes and have resources that they can access before they're really ready to hire a full-time law firm. So it's just one of the types of things we do.
Everyone, I'm Brett Topche. As Laurie mentioned, co-founder and managing director at Red and Blue Ventures. We're a seed stage VC fund, which means we're getting involved pretty much at the earliest stages of a company's operations, investing $125,000 to $250,000, often alongside other seed funds or potentially angel investors. And what makes our fund unique is that we are built fully around the University of Pennsylvania. So we're backing either technologies that come out of Penn or companies with students, faculty members, or alumni somewhere on the senior leadership team. And generally speaking, focus on the technology or technology-enabled side of the world more so than life sciences, which is in my view, a fundamentally different kind of investing that requires a fundamentally different kind of expertise. And well, if we're being totally honest, science knowledge, and my scientific education ended when I was 16, so I'm probably not the guy to be doing those deals. But on a personal level, been a VC for 18 years now, so I've seen a lot of companies over the years, and I've been through a few different cycles. I will tell you, starting in venture capital in 2002 was a very different experience than folks who may have started just a couple of years before me. So in terms of down cycles, this is my third, and hopefully have some lessons learned from those experiences that we'll be able to share today.
Great, thank you. So I thought I'd kick off the discussion with a question about kind of current behavior. So what is both your perspectives on how investors may be retrenching right now, or maybe even not retrenching, given our current economic climate and all the unexpected changes due to COVID-19?
Brett, do you want to start, or?
Sure, absolutely. So what I would say is, in the first, call it 4 to 6 weeks following COVID really hitting hard in the U.S., we saw a lot of venture funds effectively drop out of the market for a while. And it's not that they weren't writing checks, it's that they were spending the vast majority of their time with their existing portfolio companies and doing triage and figuring out who was being impacted and how much capital they were going to need to get through this, and sort of what the new normal looked like for a lot of their existing companies before they started turning their attention back externally. I think we're not necessarily fully through that cycle, but we're a good chunk of the way through that cycle. And I can tell you, most of our portfolio companies that were in need of additional cash have raised that cash at this point, and thus that has freed up some of our time and some of our attention to focus more on new investment opportunities. Now, having said that, it's certainly not back to what the old normal had been. Valuations are certainly down, and we saw that even on deals that were in process prior to all of this hitting. We saw some companies valued at less than they had been just a few weeks before. And I think how does this company fit into the new world that we're in for some indeterminate period of time is very much a consideration for future investments. So 3 months ago, travel was a really interesting sector, and right now, travel couldn't possibly be less interesting as a sector. You have to look at how do these companies fit into the world as we know it now, as well as what the world might look like going forward, and that requires both investors and entrepreneurs to make a lot of guesses and assumptions as to what things are going to look like both in the short term, the medium term, and in the long term, because I think this is going to be very much a phased process over a pretty extended period of time.
Yeah, I would say there's go ahead.
Go ahead.
I would say there's a lot of great themes there, Brett. I mean, the uncertainty, obviously, as in past situations, creates opportunity, right? And so venture capitalists don't know what to expect. They don't know what to expect in terms of what COVID is going to mean down the line. They don't know what to expect in terms of where valuations are going, all of those kinds of things. So there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. At the same time, they have funds that have been raised, and funds that have been raised need to still deploy capital. So I think investors are looking for direction, and so that creates an opportunity for entrepreneurs in that you really need, as in past situations, you need to have a plan, and perhaps entrepreneurs are good at that because they tend to be visionaries. They tend to be good at, or at least try to look at trends and look to what's going to happen down the line and try to make sense of that in the context of a business model. So I would say that I think there's probably going to be a real need or a real desire on the part of investors to hear from entrepreneurs, about what they think is going to happen in the future, right? And of course, that's what entrepreneurs do, in creating business models, under normal circumstances. So now it's no different. The only difference is you really need to have a COVID plan, right? You need to have thought about COVID in relation to your business. You can't just ignore it and say, well, our business model is not going to be affected. Virtually everything is affected by current circumstances. So if you think of that as an opportunity to reposition your business, or if you're not repositioning it, tell a story about how your business is going to either take advantage of or not be affected by COVID, and get into the leadership of predicting the future, that and what the technology that you're working on is going to look like down the line. I think that that will be really welcomed by the investor community.
Great, thanks. So there's some definite hints of positivity that you guys both articulated, despite our circumstances, which is great. And I guess that's a good segue into my next question, which is, how are smart entrepreneurs or startups pivoting given what's happened? And I think, Andy, you just addressed how the smart ones are being very proactive, explaining about how they're dealing with the situation. But we'd love to hear from both of you about what you're seeing. Are people really digging down into their business models and trying to find ways to save money that they could throw back in operations in other ways? So just wanted to get some thoughts about what you think the best startups may be doing to pivot or build confidence.
Right. Well, I think, if I may, Brett, I think the smart startups are really looking at all aspects of their business, and again, making sure that they have a plan. Of course, and maybe Brett can talk to this further, there's the funding and financing. So, you need to understand, where your capital is, what you have, what runway you need, those kinds of things. There's lots of different, areas where you can, look for funding, or perhaps grants, or those kinds of things. So looking for funding in non-traditional ways, I think is important. But beyond that, coming up with, thinking about all the aspects of your business, that are affected by COVID, from real estate, what you're doing, for space. Are you maintaining flexibility as your needs for space change? Your workforce, how are you keeping your workforce safe? How are you going to bring them back to a partial or non-remote working environment? When is that going to happen? Developing plans for all of that type of stuff, looking at your customers and potential customers and seeing how they are affected by COVID, and how you might modify your company or your product to meet them at that endpoint. Those are all the kinds of things that you absolutely have to be doing. So you just have to have a plan, I guess, is the basic mantra at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Great. First of all, in the realm of adjusting to COVID, I apologize, Andy. I was not laughing at you during that answer. Things that don't happen normally during a panel discussion. I'm currently fighting off my dog who's attempting to steal a burrito off my desk. So, I think things that don't normally happen when when I'm speaking at an event. But I mean, I think the points that you made are really important. I think a lot of companies are looking at the cost side of the equation, and that's incredibly important, both in terms of making sure the capital that you're raising can last as long as possible, because who knows what the financing markets are going to be like. As well as starting to think about fundraising maybe earlier than companies otherwise would have. I think it's wise to assume that fundraising is going to be a longer and more difficult process than it otherwise might have been. And so if you were going to wait until 3 months before you're out of cash to start fundraising, maybe it makes sense to start that process, 6 months before cash out. But the flip side, too, is it's not just cost savings. I think this market has presented some interesting opportunities in terms of growing your business faster. There are certain markets that are actually really benefiting from the current environment. Looking at e-commerce, for example, and the burrito thief has returned. If you look at e-commerce, the cost of customer acquisition has gone down to levels that I haven't seen in several years, and we're seeing some companies really lean into that and say, hey, this may be an opportunity to grow much faster than we were originally planning, and maybe grow our way to profitability rather than cutting burn to get to profitability. There are also, there are sectors that changes in regulations have really opened up. So, for example, there have been a number of changes in regulations around telemedicine. And, that's been an area that's been really thriving in terms of better reimbursement, in terms of, in some cases, the ability for physicians to practice across state lines, which takes a lot of operational cost out of telemedicine businesses. It's not just about sort of cutting your way to survival. You need to evaluate, sort of the top and the bottom of your P&L.
Great. That's great advice. And I guess I'm wondering also, if you're a startup CEO or entrepreneur right now, what do you think is a really important skill set for that person to have, or at least ask for help with? Is it, you need someone who's really good at managing kind of your tax, how you're doing taxes? Like, is there an increased importance around some of the back end financial considerations right now? I'm just curious to get your feedback on that.
I mean, I would say having a strong financial function within your company becomes increasingly valuable, because, the era of 12-month financial plans is pretty much out the window right now, because we don't know what next month is going to look like, let alone 12 months from now. So whether that's the founder or whether that is someone on the senior leadership team, the ability to not just forecast but scenario plan and be super flexible in their thinking about what might happen and how might the business adjust, I think is going to be incredibly powerful. I think it's going to be rare to see that you set your plan now and just run along those tracks for the next 6 to 12 months, because a lot of things are going to change and they're going to change in unexpected ways. So I think that's going to be really important. And along with that, communication is going to be vitally important. That's communicating with your customers. That's going to be communicating with your employees. That's going to be communicating with your investors. We're in a time of inevitably rapid change right now, and people don't really love change given the option. People like to get into the routine and work comfortably. And so being able to explain to your employees not just what you're doing, but why you're doing it, and being able to, speak to your investors, speak to your advisors, formulate a plan, formulate contingencies. I think the ones who are proactive with that communication will survive much better in this environment than those who are reactive and those who are sort of quiet about it, and people are kind of wondering why they're doing what they're doing.
Right.
Yeah, I would add, one aspect that you mentioned, expand up one point that you were making there, and that's the relationship with, your employees and consultants and team. I think leadership in that area is critical right now. Explaining to the team, how the business is going to fare, how it's going to make it through it, how it's going to pivot. Understanding, the concerns that an employee base has about, coming back to work, about job security, about all of those kinds of things, and perhaps taking advantage of, remote, continuation of remote workplace, remote working capabilities that people have had to implement, and thinking about how they will, continue, into the future, and really just staying in touch with the workforce and giving them the assurances they need to stay engaged and not worried, not being worried about, what's going to happen when, they have to come back to work, and what's going to happen to the business, and all those kinds of things. So it's workforce and communication, as Brett was saying. So I think that those are, really important, skills for leadership to think about.
That's great.
An additional thing that I
great
think is going to be
advice.
really important, just to build on that, is, and I say this not just because Andy's here, but I think a company's relationship with their attorneys is going to be really important right now, because you're going to be having to take some different and some unusual steps, whether that is figuring out workplace safety issues, whether that's figuring out employee issues, to the extent that, in some cases, companies may unfortunately have to lay people off in order to save costs. You may need to be renegotiating contracts. There's a lot of things. You may be applying for grant programs or loan programs like PPP. There's a lot of strange and not in the ordinary course of business stuff that's going to be happening in the near to medium term. And I think having a good relationship with your attorney and making sure that you're doing everything the right way can save you a lot of headaches later. It'll be tempting in the sort of panic of the moment to cut corners and save costs, but that may well come back to bite people later if they don't have all their I's dotted and T's crossed.
That's great advice. And actually, my next question I've been wondering about: are you both working with companies that have applied and or gotten PPE grants? Sorry, not PPP. PPE, the government grants, the PPP loans, or however is the most appropriate way to describe it. And how's that going? I've heard the guidance has been very uncertain, and just wanted to hear if you're working with companies like that, if you've even encouraged companies to get them, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time on that issue over the past several 5 or 6 weeks, whatever it's been, and there really has been quite a bit of confusion. the first wave of issues that we were dealing with had to do with affiliation with venture capital investors and, determining whether an investor was an affiliate for purposes of the, employee count, conditions on the loan. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that. And then as time went by, the question became the necessity and whether the funds were necessary to ongoing operations. And there was, not an availability of credit test any longer, but availability of liquidity. And so there were lots of stories about companies like Shake Shack and other public companies giving money back. And then the government Treasury instituted an ability to return funds if you thought that you weren't able to make that certification. So there were lots and lots of issues around that. They are all company specific questions about your circumstances and whether what's happening in your workforce, what's happening in your business. Do you have investors with liquidity that could perhaps put additional capital into the company? So the government did make it very hard for companies with private equity or other venture capital investors who had liquid funds to keep the money. And so everybody took a slightly different approach, but many companies became very conservative. And as you'll see in the news, lots of companies actually did, give the funds back. I think that there is an important distinction in what you do in terms of, are you planning to ask for forgiveness of the loans, having to do with use of the funds for paying employee costs, or are you planning to repay the funds one way or the other? So lots of nuances, but it has been an area of quite a bit of confusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, our portfolio companies all, evaluated the program, and we encouraged them to do so, and we encouraged them to say, does this apply to you? And I think to Andy's point, that turned into a very slippery question, not just because of confusion, but quite frankly, because of changing rules. And so the SBA and the Treasury Department have issued, I think we're now up to 9 interim final rules on who is and is not eligible, as well as a continually expanding FAQ document that has created a fair amount of confusion in the market. And to Andy's point, it appeared at first that a lot of these companies were eligible. Then they had this rule about, are you able to access money from other sources? Then they came out with another new rule that if you're taking less than $2 million, there appears to be a safe harbor where a lot of these companies would be eligible again. But many companies took it and returned it. Many didn't apply in the first place because of the confusion. And it's difficult to know over the longer term how this is being enforced, both because we don't know how it's going to be enforced in the short term, as well as there's only 6 months until a presidential election. It's entirely possible that there is a new administration that will be able to retrospectively look at this, 6 or 8 months down the road, that may be looking at the same words through a different lens. So
Right.
We've been advising companies to evaluate the program, but to be cautious and to be realistic in their interpretations of the rules and regulations as they come out and as they evolve.
Okay, that makes sense and is good to know. Just in terms of how you're working with startups, and maybe this question is a little more geared to Brett, but I know, Andy, you work with startups, and so this would apply to you as well. I mean, typically, a lot of the relationship building can occur at different investor events and live pitches in terms of a company, first getting to know you, and you may be seeing someone very compelling with a compelling pitch at a certain investor event. Are people, how are you kind of keeping your pipeline full? Are people just scheduling virtual pitches with you? Kind of how are you making sure you're still kind of getting to know entrepreneurs and companies, since everyone's basically grounded in their living rooms at the moment? Or, just would love to get your perspective on that.
Sure. So We're very much continuing to take initial meetings with entrepreneurs. We're making sure that we're attending as many events as possible. It's great because I can attend a lot of events without ever leaving the chair in which I'm currently sitting. Um, and so, for example, on Penn's campus, we found that a lot of the events that would normally happen at the end of the school year happened anyway. They just happened virtually, whether that is the startup showcase, the Penvention competition, a lot of the pitch days that would happen at the end of individual professors' classes. And so we were able to attend a lot of those, via Zoom, via Blue Jeans, what have you. So that's helped to keep the top of the funnel full. But I think another question, which is a very reasonable one, is particularly at the seed stage where we mostly invest. Most of what we're betting on is the team. There's not a whole lot of operating history to go on. And so it's a very real question. How do you get comfortable betting on a team that you've only ever met through a screen? And it's
Right.
something that we're really wrestling with. And I think we're probably spending more cycles on due diligence to get to a yes than maybe we had in the past. We're probably putting more weight on reference calls than we might have previously, and really trying to speak to as many people as possible that we know that know these entrepreneurs. And there are some things that are just going to be really difficult to evaluate over a video conference. Things like team dynamics. How can you tell how well a team works together when half the time they're interrupting each other because of technical difficulties, not because of disagreement and frustration and what have you. So it's a very different environment. And I wish I had a great answer for how you get to a decision in that environment, but it's something that we and I think most funds are working through in real time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to do the same thing. I mean, as you know, Laurie, we spend a lot of time working with entrepreneurs, before they're really, have any ability to pay legal fees and those kinds of things. So, while deals are sort of not happening at the same pace, we're just trying to spend as much time as we can counseling companies, answering questions, building relationships, holding online, seminars, all those kinds of things that Brett was mentioned, so that so we can build relationships that that last.
Okay, that's great to hear, and loved kind of the references in terms of that going up to something that's more important. That's probably good for any startup seeking funding to know. Someone famous said, "Out of every crisis comes an opportunity." I think I can't remember who said it. Maybe you guys but I guess I'm curious to hear from your point of view. I mean, in terms of this crisis and how everyone emerges eventually on the other side, is this just going to show that any startup that emerges at least, status quo or even stronger is one that's even more worth investing in? How has this crisis created opportunities for startups? Even if it's, I'd be happy to hear you guys talk about some of the new spaces that you're really interested in now, as you kind of alluded to before.
Sure. So, I'd say there's been a number of different effects. I think one of the sort of the big obvious ones, as we're all experiencing right now, is just changes in the way work happens on a day-to-day basis. And I think historically there was a lot of emphasis put on physically being together, and there was a school of thought that it's very difficult for companies to operate if you can't physically be together. And in an environment where people can't physically be together, we've been sort of forced into an experiment of like, okay, well, how might this actually work? And you're seeing companies like Twitter now has said, you know what, you never have to come back to the office. Twitter has made remote only a theoretically permanent option now. And so I think we're going to see both technologies come up to better enable that, but I also think it's going to have some really interesting impacts on geography. So if you don't need to be in San Francisco to work for Twitter, do you want to be in San Francisco? There's a lot of great stuff about San Francisco, but cost of living is not one of them. And so, might you want to, work for Twitter but live in Boise, Idaho? I don't know. But, it could be a real leveling of the playing field from a geographic standpoint. And that could impact both hiring as well as potentially fundraising. So
Right.
if all fundraising meetings are happening via a screen anyway, the fact that you may be across the street from me doesn't make it any easier for me to spend time with you. So do places start to be more geographically agnostic in where they're spending their capital, in addition to where the companies are looking to hire? I think that's going to be it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out over the next year or so.
I agree. That's
Yeah.
a great answer.
Yeah, I mean, most definitely the companies that, have taken advantage of and accurately predicted, trends, you know, you know, as those trends become realities 6 months or a year from now, are going to be very attractive companies, from an investment standpoint. And, there's first, second, and third effects, of and beyond that of what's happening. And so looking, almost every company and idea has the ability to take advantage of the effects at least one of those levels. Um, whether it be safe, workplace safety, monitoring, remote working, telemedicine, all of the kinds of things that we've talked about, and beyond. So, certainly the companies that have taken advantage of and accurately predicted those trends are going to be attractive investment opportunities a year from now.
Great. Can you each give examples maybe of a company you're working with and how they may be pivoting due to COVID-19? And it could be any pivot in terms of they're going to put off their fundraising or they're going to fundraise earlier and for, 2 years of funding. Just curious to hear some examples of what you're saying and how folks are responding.
I mean, one that comes to mind immediately, that an early stage company that we've been working with, who had technology for monitoring workforce, inside of healthcare and other institutions, and tracking behavior and those kinds of things, is pivoting to be able to do contact tracing, and thinking about an app that will enable healthcare workers and the institution to quickly know if there's an issue, every single patient and provider that's come in contact with that individual. So taking existing technology and repurposing it towards those kinds of ends is something that we're seeing, at least in one company.
That's great to hear. I look forward to the day when that I can put that on my phone and you put your finger on it and you're done. So, Brett, anything jump to mind for you?
So one that comes to mind right away is a company on campus that it was in the veterinary services business, and they'd been doing pop-up veterinary clinics,
Uh-huh.
and they've pivoted hard to a pure telemedicine model. And that's been both out of necessity, because pop-up clinics are incredibly difficult to organize in the current environment, as well as opportunity. First of all, people are a lot more reluctant to go to an in-person place, and second of all, the regulations have changed, allowing telemedicine in situations where previously it would have been precluded by regulations. So I think the companies have to have their eyes open and say, okay, well, plan A may not work right now, but plan B may become a lot more attractive than it had been.
Right. That's I know that company, and I also agree, as someone who's a dog owner, that I can, especially in this environment, see a huge value in that service. So hopefully we'll see more things like that come online. I guess I would love to hear any parting advice or kind of any the last piece of advice you're giving to all the companies you work with, whether it's, make sure you get off your Zoom calls, around 6, just because everyone's body and mind needs to take a break. It's really easy to be chained in the chair with nowhere to commute to and a lot of urgent things that need to get done, or, just to kind of pace yourself in this environment. So, would love to hear kind of what you're telling your startups, who I'm sure are even more stressed than maybe the typical business these days.
Yeah, I think for me it's kind of where we started, which is, make sure you have a plan for everything. If you should get sick, what's going to happen to the business? If, your key lieutenants get sick, what are you going to do? What are you going to do for real estate, for your work, your different workplace needs, a plan for each aspect of your business, how you're going to talk to customers, how you're going to change the development of your product, all of those kinds of things. Just making sure that you have a plan for how the world has changed and will continue to change.
I think that's really important and really good advice. I think what we're suggesting that companies do is not have a plan, but have several. To have contingency plans, because things are going to change. I mentioned earlier how e-commerce is in many ways thriving right now because of the low cost of customer acquisition. Well, a big part of why they're thriving is that a lot of their offline competitors currently aren't operating. And so when those offline competitors start to come back into the world, what do things look like? Do your cost of customer acquisition stay low? And you really need to have plan A, B, and C and not be married to any one path, because the situation on the ground is going to be constantly changing and constantly evolving. And so having contingency plans and flexibility in your thinking, I think, is incredibly important. But along with that, I think, Lori, the point you were making about self-care is incredibly powerful. It's very easy when you're working from home to work 24/7. And there's a lot of stuff out there about, the entrepreneurs who work 24 hours a day. And, that's all great in theory, but in reality, the human body is not designed to do that. And it's very easy to burn yourself out if you don't take a break. I think everyone's mental health is challenged in this environment. And I think self-care is incredibly important in a high stress environment. And yes, there's always more you can be doing for your company at any given moment. But if you burn yourself out, you're not going to be helping anybody on the back end of all this.
Thanks. That's great advice. And while you both were talking, we have some questions that came in. So the first one is interesting because I don't even know if venture capitalists existed during the Spanish flu in 1918 in Philadelphia. But is there any VC info available to compare COVID-19 to the Spanish flu? I know that there has been, some articles about this that have appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer, but maybe in terms of just businesses and how they dealt with the Spanish flu, are either of you aware of comparisons between now and then?
I mean, the gray in my beard is authentic, but I don't know 1918 all that well.
One big difference, obviously, is that virtual tools did not exist. So, it was all in person.
And what I've read was that it was an environment of constant change. Obviously, didn't get to experience it firsthand. I was negative 63 that year, but from what I've read about what was happening in 1980, first of all, to your point, venture capital was not really a thing at that point. But what kept happening is things would open, things would close, things would get scheduled, things would get rescheduled. And, that's a different environment, a difficult environment for everybody. In fact, some of the stuff I was reading about was with sports where, okay, there would be games scheduled and they'd be perpetually getting rescheduled and, half the schedule would get played. And I think, certainly medicine has changed. Our ability to work remotely has changed. So it's an extremely different environment. But what's common is that you've got to be able to prepare for uncertainty and you've got to be able to adjust on the fly, because, the the scientists and the epidemiologists have been right about a lot of things, and they've been wrong about a lot of things. And it's hard to take anything as gospel right now. No one can say with absolute certainty what's coming.
Right. Yeah, it's a challenge.
Yep. The situation has changed, but human nature has not. So,
Yeah.
People are going to not do things where there's uncertainty, but others are going to continue to look for opportunity, and
Yeah.
that's what I expect we'll see this time around as well.
On the upside, this time around, at least Philly canceled the parades.
Yes, that's a really good point, because that did not go well in 1918. Another question relates to supporting life science investments right now. The Medical Countermeasures Task Force seemed like a promising avenue to explore and address COVID and get added support, but that's been hard to navigate alone. Are you guys familiar with that program and or other potential resources?
I'm not familiar with that program, but we do have an alternative funding resources, part of our webpage, and learn that you could circulate that might be helpful. I don't know if that particular program is covered or not.
Yeah. Okay. If you could send me the link, I'd be happy to circulate it. I will say that BARDA, which is the Trump administration's main avenue for distributing money to deal with COVID mitigation, seems to be printing money because they're giving out money really fast. A lot of it is to larger companies, but not all. It's very private sector oriented. It's been a controversial entity as well. But it seems like if you can figure out how to penetrate that process or some other grant programs, the resources are coming out really quickly for a government-led agency. If there are not any other questions, I wanted to thank you both so much for joining us. As always, it's great to be with you and hear your advice and knowledge for the entrepreneurial community. Thank you for all your support for PCI and Penn.